The next speaker is Nischal Mainali, a PhD student in theoretical neuroscience at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who's interested in mathematical theories of brain functions. He's curious if and how we can use tools and ideas from neuroscience to understand AI. And he will be telling us about a geometric viewpoint for interpretability. So Nischal, if you're here, feel free to unmute yourself and share your screen. Yeah, you know what to do.
Yeah. So hi everyone, I'm Nish. I'm going to be talking about geometric regularities in transformers. And this is the work that I did as part of the PIBBSS Fellowship project, and it was done under the mentorship of Jan Kirchner. And I'm going to dive into the details right away, but just to sketch out the talk, I will start fairly broad level, showing some few results that I think are interesting and relevant from neuroscience, and trying to make a point about a geometric interpretability kind of viewpoint for AI and large language models. And then I will dive to a very specific case of it and show my experiments, do some analysis on neural networks, show some regularities, talk about potential theories. And then I will zoom back out and kind of refer back to neuroscience inspired ideas and what kind of research agenda it might suggest in terms of interpretability. So let's start. I'm going to start with the idea of population codes. So population codes, you can think of them as vectors of neural firing rates. You look at a particular brain area in animals and you make a vector of their firing rates, and this vector on certain tasks or even generally might lie on a surface, a particular kind of surface, and not anywhere else. So it's a restriction on what kind of values this vector can take. And this restriction, we can broadly think of it as a neural manifold. It need not be manifold in the sense of math. It might or might not have nice smooth structure and so on, but you can think of it as kind of the restricted space of firing rate for neural vectors. And generally, these neural manifolds, empirically, it's observed they are low-dimensional kind of interpretable structure that are found in neural population. And once we started being able to record a lot of neurons in animals, we started kind of trying to take this other perspective of geometry. On the right here, I'm going to say what this is. And I want to emphasize here, it's a dual viewpoint. So rats and mice have these cells in their brains all over, actually, called head direction cells that just encodes the direction of their head. So 0 to 2 pi, and there are these particular cells encoding a particular angle of their head. But at the same time, you can kind of look at the whole population directly, and that, of course, lies on a ring because it's like a periodic variable. So in this particular example, geometry and population code turn out to be kind of dual perspective, exactly equal perspective to each other. So geometry and circuit both are fine in terms of interpretability. But now I'm going to talk about an example where we were able to interpret what's going on purely because of a geometric viewpoint. So I will not go into the details of it, and I'm happy to talk about them more. But in this experiment, monkeys were supposed to be doing some perceptual estimation followed by a motor task. And turns out, if you look at the population trajectory during this task, the curvature of the population activity represents uncertainty the animal has about some perceptual variable out in the world. And this would be completely invisible in a circuit point of view. You couldn't find this kind of curvature encoding of a perceptually relevant variable that is used for Bayesian updating just by looking at a circuit level single cell kind of firing rate point of view. So here geometry was pretty useful. And another another line of argument for why geometry codes are better is the idea of robust codes. So grid cells, these are really famous cells. So they have these hexagonal receptive field structures. So a given grid cell will fire at a few different locations in an environment. So they form a map of the environment, but the places they fire in an environment lies on a hexagonal lattice and really nice, clear crystalline structures. But turns out this is only really the case when the environment is really simple. So some small environment, nice boundaries and so on. But moment you go to some environment like environment 2, the grid structure is lost. You can't really see the regularities there. But these grid cells also kind of topologically form a torus. And this was actually a theoretical prediction that was recently verified to be true, that the neural activity of grid cells lie on a torus. And in fact, it lies on a torus on other environment and other situations too, even when the animal is sleeping. So this kind of geometric viewpoint turns out to be a lot more robust explanation of what's going on, rather than kind of single cell hexagonal receptive field version of explanation. So here we see that kind of geometric and topological explanation end up being a lot more robust explanations. And this maybe in neural networks, we don't want to try to find every single neural correlate for every new network, but we want to find some kind of robust geometric structure and so on. And maybe something that translate between networks of similar type might be something that we want to interpret. But now I'll go to some, before going to that, I actually want to talk a little bit more about hypothesis that people have in neuroscience. This is not really a proof, but people tend to think that this low-dimensional geometric structure in neural activity is implemented by some low-rank structure in the connectivity itself. So very quickly over the figures on the left, you see a theoretically proposed continuous attractor model for grid cells. On the bottom left panel, you see the 3 Fourier modes, so 3 directions in the space that form the weight matrix. So the weight matrix is sum of these 3 modes. And then you can kind of handcraft these attractor models, and you see they have like grid cell-like behavior, they lie on torus and so on. Then people recently trained a neural network, a recurrent neural network, to do path integration, which is to create a map of the environment for the animal. And kind of inspired from this theoretical proposal, they sorted the neurons in a certain way, and we're trying to uncover the structure in a trained neural network. And turns out the neural network not only produces the same kind of grid cell-like behavior when they're trained to do this path integration task, but the connectivity, the weight matrix that ends up being learned also has this low-rank structure. And this was only really possible to find because we had a hypothesis about it being there. Otherwise, this structure would be completely lost in the mess of the weight matrix. This hypothesis is pretty central in current day neuroscience, and it's also something that I'll be working with. So let's make these ideas of dimensionality more precise. So why start with ideas of dimensionality for interpretability? Another kind of example to motivate that, which is that some people went and measured neural activity in a monkey when it was doing certain tasks, and turned out this activity, the effective dimensionality, defined in some way that I'll not go in detail, will reflect the correct or error trials. So when the population dimensionality effective is lower, then the animal is performing much worse than the effective population dimensionality is higher. And this is like in the same experiment between trials. So it's a very strong correlative to animals' performance itself. So these are the kind of ideas that I started out the fellowship with, and like trying to understand if any of this is going to be useful. So I decided to look at these kind of this dimensionality kind of notions. And in particular, the setup that I chose was that of for induction heads. I will not go into the details of transformers, assuming that here a little bit, but transformers are the architecture that underlie the success of the amazing large language models we see these days. And they in particular have these attention mechanism, which allows them to query back into their context window and see what might be relevant and allow them to do in-context learning. And this paper from Anthropic found that these might be implemented in a circuit kind of viewpoint through a particular mechanism in induction head that looks back and copies the information that's relevant now. And they did this by doing some kind of prefix matching behavioral experiment. So they set up a kind of elaborate behavioral experiment where the model had to do some kind of in-context learning task, and they trained 3 networks, simplified networks, 1, 2, and 3 attention-only attention-only networks. And turns out for more than 1 layer network, suddenly the behavior of prefix matching gets really good fairly early in the training. So the y-axis here is prefix matching score. And you need to note that the x-axis is in log scale. So this happens really quickly, and you see a sudden emergence of this prefix matching ability. And in fact, this is also reflected in like in-context loss. So this is defined by how well you can learn within the context. This ability also gets much better fairly suddenly in this like very short time window at the beginning of the training. And this doesn't happen for one layer network. So I started by thinking, is there some other kind of non-behavioral kind of things I can look at the network, try to see where this kind of abilities might be coming from during the training process. So I focused on looking at the OV and QK weights. Again, I'm not going to go into the details, but roughly OV determines like what to copy from within the context window, and QK looks at which time in the past is relevant for making the next token prediction right now. And these are represented by matrices. So we can do dimensionality analysis of matrices, and in particular, we can look at what's called an effective rank. So this is what I did. I looked at the effective rank for OV and QK matrices, and you can define effective rank as sort of a entropy of singular values here. They're not probability distribution, but we can calculate the singular value associated with the matrix, normalize them so that they add up to 1, and then treat them as a probability distribution, and then define the entropy on them. And e to the power this entropy is defined as effective rank. This quantity has some nice properties and so on that I'll not go into detail here, but it kind of measures the spread of eigenvalue in how many kind of interesting directions the weight, weight map, the linear map is gonna map the inputs to. And so when I did this analysis throughout the training time for 1, 2, 3, and 4 layer networks, attention-only network, here's what we see. So again, x-axis is in log scale. The golden bar is when the in-context learning ability shows up. And here what we see is something like the effective rank is fairly constant in both particularly in OV until this time window, and then you see like this very clear separation of 1 layer network and 2, 3, and 4 layer network, where 1 layer network is not learning the task and 2, 3, and 4 layers are, and you see the dip in the effective rank here, and you see phenomenologically similar behavior in QK. QK is generally a little bit harder to interpret because it's inside a nonlinearity, but either way, you see this effective dip in the entropy of the singular values. What this means is something like it started learning some particular features, and it has really specialized on a few features. I'm going to do a kind of a sketchy theoretical analysis of this later, but for now, I'm going to leave it at that. And then I also went and looked at effective activity dimension. So now the activity here that I'm looking at is the activity that's being written into the residual stream from transformer heads. And for these activity, I can define kind of the effective average cross-correlation matrix with itself and ask how many features are in this cross-correlation matrix. And this can be done by something called participation ratio. Again, it also measures some spread of eigenvalues of the cross-correlation matrix. And here what we see is, again, something fairly interesting, which is that exactly during this time window, the activity, the number of features kind of in the correlation matrix peaks and then is sustained throughout the learning process, but 1 layer network really is like diverging and doing something else entirely. It cannot keep up with like the things that it has learned. So these are the regularities, kind of geometric regularities we should during the training process. And now the question is, does this generalize to like a bigger network? So I looked at GPT-2 type networks, and turns out in these networks too, the kind of general structure is fairly present. In fact, there is some meta regularities, which is like better networks, stronger networks behaviorally, and also in terms of number of the parameters. Dip lower, have a larger basin of the dip, but this qualitative behavior persists in both OV and QK matrix effective rank for larger networks also. And this is also the case for activity dimension, where all the good networks that are able to learn persist in the features that they have learned in this small time window. And in particular, if you look more carefully here, you see a separation around fairly early on, before even the features are learned, of the speed at which they're being learned and the height at which they go to. And stronger networks are always on top of each other, like stronger and larger the network, higher it is. So that's also an interesting regularity here. I'm going to go to kind of trying to sketch a start of a theory, and this is going to be particularly focused on OV and QK matrices right now. And this is not going to be so detailed, but I'm going to kind of take a kind of guess ansatz from the work by Sachs, Mitchell, and Ganguly on a linear network. So they did some analysis of learning in linear networks. While the network themselves are linear, the learning dynamics is highly nonlinear. And what they found is the separation of learning of spectral coefficients. So like the eigenvalues that we're seeing. In the shallow case, we get the right figure where there is not that much of an interesting behavior happening. But on the left, we see when networks are deeper, there is this time scale separation. So stronger features are learned first, and then saturate, and then second feature, and third feature, and so on. So there is this like time scale separation. And one idea, the reason I looked at this is like one idea effective rank is dipping for OV and QK matrix is because at some point in training, it has suddenly learned the most important feature it needs to learn about the language, and it still hasn't learned other features. And at that point, it will really be specializing in few directions and not so much in other directions. So using this ansatz, I did some simulations, and here are the figures. On the left, this is simulations. On the top of the left panel, you see just evolution of singular values taken in the same way as from the Sachs-Ganguly paper. And on the bottom, I calculated effective rank given these eigenvalues. And you see the same dynamics, which is that for time being, it stays flat, and then suddenly the effective rank dips down and then starts finally gradually recovering. And on the right, I'm plotting the same figures as before, just for reference, that it really qualitatively captures this behavior. And at least for me, hints towards there being this temporal separation of learning spectral features. And I think some more theory work can be done in this direction. Cool. So that was all the detailed things that I had to talk about. But now I'm going to kind of sketch a research program. This is after a lot of thoughts and conversation I had about what kind of ideas are useful in terms of interpretability from neuroscience or like vaguely neuroscience adjacent kind of fields that at least I know about. So I'm going to sketch at least the question that I'd be interested in working on in future, and also take this as a provocation or an invitation to talk to me about if you have ideas about this and like ways to pursue these questions. So first is kind of zoning in on this spectral analysis. You could probably do a lot with the idea that there's this temporal separation of feature learning, and this might allow you to explain various non-linear learning behavior that you see in transformer and other neural networks. There is also this idea of like, if maybe these spectral, the directions corresponding to these spectral values are the correct direction to intervene on in the network, both during the training time and inference time. So just keeping track of which directions are being learned strongly during the training time might give us some ability to kind of write into the network when we want to. The second is the idea of dimensions and capacity. Much has been done with the idea of capacity in neuroscience. Capacity roughly captures the idea of disentangled representation. When representations are disentangled, they have high capacity. And I think one way to perhaps think about what happens during in-context learning or even through the layers in the network is the steady growth of capacity. And this actually can be formalized and analyzed, and people have done this in like vision type network, and you do see this regularity, and capacity gives you a more finer grain idea of what exactly the network is capable of than doing all sorts of behavior or like just simple test error kind of analysis. And the second idea is also about superposition and capacity, which works in Hopfield network and memory network in neuroscience. Generally includes this idea of like distributed representation, superposed neurons, and there they happen when you have kind of networks operating at their maximum capacity level. So maybe there's a connection there. More broadly, there is this also idea of geometry. And fixed points in LLMs. LLMs are autoregressive networks, and they can kind of take input they can take their output as their own input. So it will be interesting to see, thinking of them as this sort of dynamical system, what kind of fixed points they go to. In particular, this is interesting because neural dynamics, at least in recurrent neural networks, people use now to model various brain functions. A lot is contingent on the fixed point. Like the fixed point implements various types of cognitive functions. So it might be interesting to see that. It's a little speculative. And the second question is kind of natural metric tensor, kind of like natural way to measure inner product or distances of activations. Probably this Euclidean way of looking at it is not going to suffice. And I might touch on this briefly after this. And then there's this miscellaneous kind of line of work on, okay, I have 5 minutes. Work on renormalizing internal activity to uncover structure. There is also something called phenomenological renormalization group that you can do on top of neural networks and kind of try to recover some sort of structure on them. And this might be an interesting thing to do. And finally, you can probably try to look at Lyapunov spectrum, how information propagates through the network, both through the layers and also through the context window itself, like how information at time 0 gets propagated at time t and so on. Again, these are kind of speculative. I'm not exactly sure how to formalize the notion as Lyapunov spectrum here, but generally talking about dynamical systems, these are useful kind of things to look at, just like dimensionality. So after this, I'm going to very briefly just show you figures of a slightly different line of thing that I also did during the PIBBSS Fellowship. And I want this not to be a focus, but maybe if people want, you can talk to me in the breakout room, which is this idea of intensive PCA by defining some sort of exotic metric on the activity. So instead of looking at them in Euclidean metric, you can look at them in kind of negative curvature space with some weird distance between them. And that allows you to do PCA in a lot more effective way in high dimension. High dimension doing PCA, basically everything saturates and you don't get much. But using this distance, you're able to get these really nice PCA diagrams. So here I'm just plotting PCA axis, and the curves you see are actually evolution of the training activity throughout the training time. And you see one of the network has clearly gone off compared to the other three. So this is probably, you could guess this is the network that was not able to learn the task. So you could actually do this visualization or monitoring of the network during the training time once you can define kind of right notion of distance on the activity itself. And this kind of a visualization, now I can just do 3D visualization, also carries when you combine networks and so on, you can kind of clearly see networks separation in this PC axis in terms of the things they learn and features they learn and so on. I don't know if much theory can be done in this, but I think as a monitoring tool during the training process, it might be interesting, but I'm going to leave it at here without too much details and would love to talk about it more if people have questions. Yes, that's all. Thank you very much. And thank you especially for the PIBBSS program for giving me the opportunity.
All right, thanks for the fantastic talk. Here's another virtual round of applause from everyone. We don't have any questions yet in the chat, so I'll wait just a couple minutes, and then after that I have like 1 or 2 questions that we could ask, but ideally like those would be lower priority. All right, then I guess my question, okay, we have one here. So Martin Soto asks, I for one would like to hear more about fixed points in large language models, if you have more thoughts about that.
I mean, I think right now the thought I have is it's something fairly easy to check empirically and should definitely be checked. Just looking at what happens if you keep feeding the output of networks to itself, and especially not only looking at the network output, but looking at kind of internal dynamics and the fixed points the activations themselves go to. And I feel like the fixed points that they go will themselves be interpretable in some ways. They will probably carry some sort of meaning. Dynamical systems are heavily influencing the dynamics by presence of fixed points and so on. So I don't know what that sort of influence and so on will look like, but yeah, I think it's a very interesting kind of empirical first type question to ask right now.
Great, thank you. We have time for one more question, so I'll wait for a minute or so again, or actually a couple more. We finished a bit early. So I guess, well, my question would be, you kind of like started out this talk with the motivation of looking at spatial circuitry in like the famous like grid cell patterns, and then also kind of like neural networks that we cover that when doing path integration. And when it comes to space, it's kind of like very obvious what the dimensionality is somehow, at least if you look at like a 2D Cartesian kind of space. But my high level question would be, when it comes to like transformers, and particularly also in the language space, it's somehow less intuitively obvious. Like, what is one dimension? Like, what's the dimensionality of language that we would kind of expect to emerge in like a fully trained language model, essentially? I don't know if you have a few words you would like to say about that.
Yeah, I think like this is a good question, because it goes to the point that we don't really have a very principled way of getting and uncovering these kind of structure. When it works, even in neuroscience, it's either like kind of theory driven or like luck driven. I think maybe doing something like hypothesis-free analysis. I'm thinking of something like topological data analysis, which doesn't require you to define coordinates and just looks at activity directly. Maybe there is some hope of discovering geometry there that way. And I think we will not be able to get anything nice and clear and crystalline like grid cells for sure. And it also goes to the question of what is the sort of right geometries. And I think in large language model, at least my intuition is that they produce probability distributions. So we should clearly be looking at geometries and like kind of inner products and so on that relate to probability distribution. The visualizations that I showed earlier was also by kind of treating the activations themselves as probability distribution and defining something called Bhattacharya distance on top of them. So maybe that is one way to start, at least like space is natural, but maybe probabilities are natural for transformers. Not sure.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, great answer. Yeah, I think it's such an interesting, fascinating talk, and also this great finding that the effective dimensionality kind of decreases before increasing again slightly. I think that's really cool. There still are no questions, so I guess my next question would be the kind of general one about what do you think are the applications of these kinds of findings, assuming that there are these learning dynamics, that there is a fixed dimensionality? How would you relate that to like understanding safety or possible safety, kind of understanding larger neural networks, and understanding maybe biological social systems?
Yeah, so I didn't touch on this much during the talk because time, but I think the strongest possible thing that can come true, which maybe not, but kind of the strongest possible use of this is something like each of the spectral directions that are being temporarily segregated during the learning process correspond to some interesting features about language, and all the behaviors that a language model can do maybe can be thought of as creatively combining these spectral features and so on. So it's like kind of the underlying skill that the network has. Each spectral direction is the underlying skill that the network has that it can then combine to produce behavior. And I think if we can kind of like chart out what these spectral direction mean and what kind of capabilities, for example, like induction has come about when you start learning the first strongest feature, or like first one or two strongest feature. And then you suddenly see these behavior capabilities of prefix matching because you learn the first few features. And if something like this can generalize, where learning particular directions correspond to unlocking certain set of behaviors, and if we can make a map between that, I think that will be pretty useful for kind of steering the neural network.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you so much again for the talk.